Hello, everyone. My name is Esther Lee, co-founder of the Chinese American Heritage Foundation. CAHF promotes the recognition, appreciation, and celebration of historical contribution made to the United States by citizens of Chinese heritage. Welcome to day 17 of our 31 days webinar celebrating AAPI Heritage Month. Today, our topic is breaking the bamboo ceiling. Our moderator is Mr. Buck G. He is an executive advisor to Ascend, a nonprofit Pan-Asian organization of business professionals. After 35 years in engineering, marketing, and management roles in Silicon Valley, Mr. G retired in 2008 from Cisco System, where he was the vice president and general manager of the data center business unit. He joined Cisco with his 2004 acquisition of NDMore Systems, where Mr. G was the president and CEO. He has also taught computer and electrical engineering courses at Stanford University and Howard University. Mr. G will introduce our three amazing panelists. Just a reminder, if you have any question, please type it in the Q&A box. Without further ado, let me present you Mr. Buck G.
Well, first of all, thanks to Esther and Wilson for putting this whole month together. So I hope some of you have watched other sessions as well. Tonight, I hope we'll have an interesting discussion. We'll try to keep it so that we have, let's say, last 15 minutes or so for Q&A. So please, if you have questions as we go along, type them in the Q&A box, and Esther hopefully will monitor that, and we can get to them in the end. So to start, let me, so I'm going to make the introductions and then put up a little bit of data then before going into the conversation. So let me introduce first Dennis Hirotsu. Dennis retired in 2016 as Vice President of R&D from Procter & Gamble. His 35-year career at P&G included 13 years in Asia and executive sponsorship of APIs in R&D. He's currently an executive advisor to the Society of Asian Scientists and Engineers, helping to build development programs for API STEM professionals. So welcome, Dennis.
Thank you.
Next, Jennifer Guo. China-born Jennifer joined Chevron in the Corporate Procurement MBA Development Program in 2002. She's held several supply chain leadership roles in the United States and Angola. And in 2018, she became the first female general manager of upstream supply chain, responsible for all goods and services in the global upstream organization. Congratulations and welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you, Bob.
And lastly, we have Alan Lowe, who I've known for, I think, over a decade. Alan is Vice President and Deputy General Counsel at Facebook, where he leads a 300-person team responsible for legal counseling for all of Facebook's products, as well as overseeing Facebook's IP intellectual property matters worldwide. Before Facebook, he served as Deputy General Counsel for Patents at Google and Vice President of Legal at Juniper Networks. He has actively participated in the Asian employee resource groups at Facebook and Google, and was part of the inaugural class of Stanford's Advanced Leadership Program designed for Asian American executives in 2010, program that I started, and he was in my first inaugural class. So thank you, Alan.
Thank you, Buck. That's where we met.
So before we get started, what I want to do is I just want to throw up a couple of slides just to tee up the question. Be sure that everybody on the call understands where we're at. Okay, so just hold on. It'll take just a minute. There. Okay. So just a couple of data slides. This is EEOC data. This is workplace data from 2018, all industries nationally. What I have here broken down by race is the management pipeline. What you see is the blue, orange, and gray bars are blue are the white collar worker bees, the non-management. The orange is middle management, and the gray is executives. So you can see, if you look at the whites on the left, the numbers keep going up as you go through management. 69% of worker bees, 74% of middle managers, and 84% of executives are white. Compare that to Asian, we're 13% of the white collar workforce, but then you go to middle management, it goes to 7%, executive management, 6%. So even though at every level, actually it turns out we're greater than the numbers in population, 6%. So people think we're overrepresented. That's kind of true, but if you look at the promotion to the grades, actually we may be, you know, overrepresented, but in terms of promotions, we're less likely to get promoted than whites, similar to blacks and Hispanics. So our problem is not getting in there; it's getting up the ranks. I put the numbers up for Silicon Valley, and Silicon Valley, the dynamic is the same. You can see that the numbers go up for whites and they go down for Asians, Hispanics, and blacks. Silicon Valley is unique for two reasons, and I use this as an example because it turns out that Asians in Silicon Valley are most of the white collar workforce, 45%, the largest cohort, 45% of the white collar workforce versus 42% for whites. But if you look at the executive levels, it's 25%. So it goes from 45% to 25%. Turns out that's the biggest drop of any race. So even though Asians in Silicon Valley are the most likely to be hired, they're really the least likely to become executives. Now, that's just in Silicon Valley. So what's it like, for example, in Cincinnati? What's it like in P&G, Dennis? That's an entirely different industry, entirely different place, entirely different workforce.
So if people don't know about P&G. P&G is a consumer products company. You probably
Procter
know
and Gamble.
more.
Procter and
Yeah,
Gamble.
Procter and Gamble. You know us more by our brands like Tide, Pampers, Always, Feminine Protection, Crest toothpaste, things like that. Yeah, we mirror the national picture that you threw up there, Buck, where we see Asians, and we hire based on availability, and Asians are frankly rocking it at universities. So among the top universities we recruit at, Asians are very prevalent, about 14 to 15%, double our population of 6%. But then you get to the senior levels and you see the same drop off that you just described. And the way that I would describe it is we see that the first one, maybe two promotions happen, but then there's a drop off. And I call that the gap between operational management versus strategic and influential management. And I can go on that more in the future, but you know, that drop is really the key.
What about a Chevron, Jennifer? What do you see in oil and gas?
Yeah, but I think it's also a similar trend here in terms of entry-level professionals. So we're around 14 to 16%. So very similar to what Dennis just talked about. And then when you get to middle management and the senior management, it's a similar trend that just continue to decrease. I would say one thing we as a company, Chevron, did is to publish this data, and not only just the data by the ethnic group, but also getting into a breakdown by disaggregate data by gender and by ethnic group together. So with that, we can even see, even within the Asian group, you know, Asian female, for example, the leadership disparity there is even bigger issue than Asian male.
I know data is always important. Certainly, when I started this question at Cisco, what I did is got the data out, and the executives looked at it. I mean, and they were shocked. They were no one knew about it. No one looked at the data that way. So getting data is great. And Facebook is a data-driven company, right? Right, Alan? I think it is.
Yeah, we certainly have a lot of data. Our data looks very much like the data, Buck, that you put up around Silicon Valley. We've been publishing a diversity report over the last 6 years, and if you look at our latest numbers, Asians represent about 44% overall of the company, and whites are 41%. So it's almost spot on to the data you showed. But we do see the big fall off for Asians at leadership versus a rise for whites in leadership. We also break out technical versus non-technical, and so this is in our diversity report. And if you look at Asians in our company, you know, while 44% is overall, at the technical level, it's 53%. And so it's heavily brought up because we have so many engineers who have Asian background, whereas non-technical is 25%. And so if we didn't have that technical group cohort to bring up the average, we would be much closer. It's still high relative to the national average, but still closer to it.
So if it's prevalent everywhere and data is available, how come it's not changing? I mean, first of all, what's going on? I mean, what you know? I mean, Yeah, I mean, let's start with you, Jennifer. I mean, what's going on? In particular for Asian women too, because Asian women, you pointed out Asian women. What's going on with women, Asian and Asian women?
Yeah, Buck, I think that's what we're here to discuss, right? So I'll probably just kick off by saying it's a quite complex issue here. It's not just one factor. You know, there's certainly some individual factors. There's also organization factors. And there's a culture element as well. I mean, I was born in Beijing, moved to US as an adult. So I certainly went through a lot of cultural assimilation, have to adjust my own style. So I definitely see individual organization, culture, and many elements just create this whole thing we're looking at. So I'm definitely looking forward for the discussion we can have as a group.
We're having discussion. So you raised an interesting question. Culture. So you came from China and here. What cultural what change did you see in terms of the difference between the way you had to adjust?
It's a different way of communication and different value system, right? And again, because you're not the majority as a population, so how we behave, how we communicate, how we interact with people, not necessarily well understood by people. Like I'll give you a simple example.
Give an example, yeah.
We're very humble as a Chinese. You know, I was taught to be humble since I was a kid, right? So we are not good at self-advocating. But here, when you work in the US, the humble part, although it's a good attribute, could be seen as not confident. Right, and we like to work through issues in a non-confrontational way, but here, if you're not very assertive enough, you cannot get your point across. So you have to learn to adjust your style, and you also have to work with others so they understand your communication style, and then just together build a more inclusive working environment.
So I'll ask Dennis then. So what I understand from Jennifer is, in order to be successful, you have to be, since you're not humble, you have to be arrogant. And since you can't non-confrontational, arrogant, arguing guy who loves to argue. Is that right?
No, at least from my experience, no. So a little background on, I'm third generation Asian American. So my grandparents came to the United States. And also on top of that, I sponsored the Asian group, did a lot of mentoring. And with SACE, I've interviewed about 40 executives who have gotten within 2 levels of the CEO and talked about their career path. And the conclusion that I've drawn, like Jennifer said, it is cultural. But the belief I have of the people who have actually succeeded at this is they kept their values, but they developed behavioral agility. So we talk about Asians respect authority. Well, in the US, in a corporate environment, you need to respect authority. But the behaviors that are assigned to respecting authority, there's a much broader range. You can challenge if you do it in a polite way. You can have a discussion about what's behind these requests you're giving me. I worked in Japan, Buck. I saw some Japan companies operated.
Yep.
You don't get to ask those questions, right? Only if you go out to drinks with people do you get to ask those questions. So there's just different cultural ways to do things. And almost all the executives I met developed what I call agility to keep their values intact, but then develop behavioral agility.
Agility, Alan?
Yeah, you know, I think that's a nice way to say it. I have talked about the same thing in terms of values versus skills. Values are those core things that make up who you are, and you don't want to change and you don't want to compromise. And when you talk about being authentic, you want to like be true to your values and have integrity. But skills are things you can learn, and you know, you called it, you know, agility and behaviors, Dennis. But you know, it's kind of like, hey, you know, I'm not a good public speaker. Well, that's not a value, you know, and so you can't say that bad communication is a value. It's just you haven't learned how to do that. And I think with the on the cultural side that Jennifer was talking about, you know, as I'm a second generation Asian American, you know, I was brought up and taught certain things that my immigrant parents believed in, and so that included, you know, deference to authority and harmony. Don't rock the boat. Saving face. You know, you don't want to, like, I don't know how many times my mom said, you know, don't embarrass the family. So that's somewhere embedded in my head. And I think I did that plenty in school when the principal called my mom. Humility, the whole idea of working hard and being recognized for it. We kind of inherently have that belief system that this is how things should work, and we're taught that that's how we're supposed to act, but the system is different. And so when we're operating on one set of beliefs and the system operates on a different set of beliefs, then we're going to be challenged.
And Buck, I could add to what Alan said.
Absolutely.
So like at P&G, I spent 35 years ratcheting up talking about myself, which was not easy. But now I can talk about myself all day, by the way. But then I come home and my wife is more traditionally family Asian raised. And she's like, can you just turn it off, man? Come on, right? So, this, even that agility
I had
is
the
my
same
home
experience
life
too.
and my
Yep.
work life.
Yep. Yeah, you are two different people. Yeah, I mean, one value is the same, but behavior, you don't talk to your boss the same way you talk to your wife. Right? That's basically.
She is my boss, but yes, I get it. Yes.
Okay. All right. Okay. But Alan, Alan raised an interesting question. Two interesting questions. First question is the culture is not ingrained just because you were born in China, like Jennifer, but your mother and your grandmother pass on these things too as well, right? So and because most of the Asian population is in the United States, I think 70%, I think, is first generation. I suspect probably 90% first, second, or third. We're all still have that imprint of Asian culture, of being humble and being non-confrontational, right? Yeah. So first of all, before we get into what can be done about it, why is this? If we all know this, why is it so hard to be adaptable? I'm right? I mean, if somebody else who's listening to this can just say, "Oh, that's it. Okay, I'll just change."
Well, it takes a lot of learning, right? So just like learning any skill, I think learning takes time. And if it's in your value system, which, by the way, I totally agree, the value and the skills, those are two different things.
Right.
If it's in your value system, it's very deep, right? So it takes years to learn. So it takes a lot to adjust, but skills, certainly you can learn. And most of the things I think I learned is, I actually find a way to find the right balance. There's a good saying, too much of good thing is not good, right? So I think that being humble is great, but if you stay quiet, not speaking up, who can read your mind? If you have a great idea, you got to share, and you got to be able to manage a healthy debate in order to make a full contribution. So all of those things are learned skills, and certainly I think to be a visible leader, that's a required skill, regardless of your cultural background.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think being when you're raised with those values, you can't just change it. You can't throw that out later because someone says that doesn't work here. There's another layer to this. There's kind of these Asian values that we're talking about, but then there's the Asian American experience as well. And I think, one of the things that we don't probably spend enough time talking about is assimilation, and how so many of us have tried to fit in our entire lives. And so, when you've gone your whole life for, since childhood, your young adulthood, and beyond, just trying to fit in, you've now made it so that you're not easy. It's not easy to change you anymore. You're trying to fit in. And then you layer on top of that other things like worthiness. I think a lot of people suffer from the idea that, they may not be good enough. They're just lucky to be here. They've kind of been, taught and told that you should be happy with what you've got. Back in the old country, it was a lot worse. So we don't complain a whole lot because we feel lucky just to be here. We don't think we're good enough for the next level. And then I would ask the last thing, and this has certainly been personal for me, is just the idea of expectations. When I think a lot of us we feel the pressure from peers, from family, from parents, from others in terms of what they want from us. And I think that affects also how we behave and how we show up as well.
So Dennis, I had a question, but you're going to say something, Dennis?
Yeah, well, and the one thing I'd add on that is one thing I've learned, being older, maybe I'm sort of like you, Buck, but anyway, there's no such thing.
Not as old as me, I'm sorry.
There's no such thing as perfect self-awareness, right? I mean, especially in terms of how others perceive us. And so as I've mentored young Asians and I've realized myself, it's like sometimes we feel like we're speaking up, but people are like, you're not speaking up at all. But we feel like, oh, I'm speaking loud. It's like, oh my gosh, I could barely hear you. And without having coaching on your behaviors from someone you trust, who's looking at you from one or two levels above, it's very hard to know how people perceive your actions and to develop those capabilities. And we, as Alan said, we build them automatically because of our upbringing, right? In our family, it's like the water we swam in. So now it's like, oh my gosh, we're in a different pool of water. Like, wow.
Yeah,
So
I think
go ahead.
Yeah, I really like what Dennis said. It's about your own judgment versus other people's judgment, right? Because like when I speak, for example, the Chinese way, where I grew up, is more kind of monotone. I think is passion in my view, but people feel like we don't have the passion. So when I watch others, I think there's more animated gestures and all those things added versus my style. So there's learning in that aspect as well, right? So how you communicate, how you really show your passion and show your confidence.
So I want to. I have one question I want to ask, but I think it's a good point in the sense that what you need to understand, what people need to understand is people's perception of what you're doing, not just your perception of what you're doing, and understand how they view you and how they whether what you say or how you say it, right? That's the thing. So you have to understand how people perceive you. Okay.
And I'll give you a funny quote I've got.
Yep.
Wes, it's like leadership is in the eye of the beholder, right? So it really is true. I mean, when people think, are they a good leader? It's all based on what other people think. And I once had a young guy I was mentoring who said, I'm a great leader, just nobody will follow me. And I go, that doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever, right?
Yeah, that's an old saying that I use to say when I'm the leader and I'm talking to people who work for me, I say it doesn't matter how good you think you are. What's important is how good I think you are, right? And if you don't communicate that, it doesn't matter how good you are, right? But
Can I ask you a question then?
Absolutely.
But I think what Dennis said is very important, but leadership is definitely in other people's eyes. But
Exactly.
who should be the one judging that? Is that the people we lead, or is that the top management? So I think a lot of time I see it's two different views, right? So leadership from your team, they are inspired by the true you, how good you are in delivering results, how you empower people. But leadership from the top, a lot of time could be based on limited information about your work, a lot about your appearance.
Yep, it is. Because what a lot of what you communicate upward is what happens in meetings and verbal conversations. Because and the first page of a 30-page document, that's about it. Obviously, I do want to raise a question I saw an interesting question in the Q&A session, and I thought we should probably address it. And I'll frame it this way. The question really was, aren't there any Asian values that make sense in work? And it suggests we're giving something up to be successful, to assimilate. Can you address? Can anyone address that? Because that was the undertone. Is there any? It's like you're saying, well, being humble, that's a value that doesn't work. Being non-confrontational, that doesn't work.
I never said that, but I think you said that.
But the question is, are these are all things that don't work? Can you please tell me something that does work? So what's the problem here with that question? Because I think the question is incorrectly stated. But Jennifer, you're going to object to what I said.
Yeah, so I think earlier when I shared an example about humble, confrontation versus the collaborative style, and then you said, well, do we need to just be the opposite? Right. I don't think so. I actually found I don't see any value that Asian carry is really bad. It's just too much of that is not good. So like being humble, that's a great attribute, right? And you're open-minded, you're a better listener, you're better in collaboration. But if you're too quiet because being humble, you always think like other people's idea would be better, and that stop you from sharing, then that would become a bad thing. So I think what in the learning space is more of a situational assessment, adjustment. It's not like totally forget about my value and be a different person. So I don't consider this as 100% like a fitting in. I think is what it requires for you to be an effective leader and what you need to learn in that space.
Yeah, here's how I think of it, because we spent a lot of time talking about values and the Asians, you know, in companies and their attributes. But there's other aspects to how we got to the data that you showed, Buck. So like at the institutional level, at the company level, you know, I think there's a certain amount of, let's call it institutional discrimination, you know, how we define, like how the company values people. So it's, you know, we do performance ratings, you know, for us twice a year. So how do we define what a higher rating is versus a lower rating? We build that into a system. And so now the system is looking for certain attributes and certain behaviors. So when you try to match how people show up and their behaviors versus what the system says, right, if there's a mismatch, you get rejected. It also goes to like how we define leadership. How do we define who should get promoted? So you've got the institutional level. Below that, you've got basically what I would say at the leadership level and the individual leaders, how they perceive people of Asian descent, you know, Asian heritage. So basically bias. And what biases do people have based on stereotypes, based on assumptions that they have because someone looks and appears and has, you know, Asian heritage. So it could be things like you're perceived automatically without saying anything, but simply because you're Asian as being technical, but not strategic. And so, you know, people might put you in that bucket, or, you know, you're not ambitious, you know, you're quiet. So I'm going to assume about you that you don't care about promotion, or that you're not a good communicator. So there's a lot of assumptions that we have to be aware people are placing on us, irrespective of the substance or the merits. And so what does that mean? It means that you can't just be good anymore. Like you have to be great. Like you have to be even better, because people have assumptions and they're going to apply confirmation bias. It is, as soon as they see it show up one time, they're going to say, I knew it. The person is not very strategic because they were doing something technical. So what that also means is that we don't get many second chances. So we have to just be aware that the system itself plus who is judging us, they have these biases and they have these stereotypes.
So I completely agree. So my question to, let's say, to Dennis' example is being aware of the fact that people have bias. I mean, you see your face and thinking, bang, minority, quiet, you know, not a great leader, kind of, you know, right, humble, self-effacing, blah blah blah. What would you what advice would you give to person now that you're, if you, now these people who are listening to us, oh, okay, I'm aware. Now what do I do? Now what do I do? Dennis?
Yeah. Well, and I'll answer both your questions if I could.
Okay.
So the first thing I think is very, very important to show your individuality, right, in the United States of America. It's very, very important. Your personality, your passions, your strengths, you've got to make them visible, right? I mean, because people aren't going to look below the surface. Executives just don't have time. So I spent a lot of time. I always tell a lot of my mentees, you want Asian to be at least the fourth thing people use, if not lower, when they describe you. You know, you're good technically, you solve problems, you're good at organization, you do this, right? If you can't get it to number 4, you're not expressing your individuality enough. In my interviews, I'll tell you 3 things I found about these Asian leaders that I think corporate America could use more of, if I could, right? You asked, that was the question on the internet. Yeah. So number 1 is I find the Asian leaders really embrace the collective over the individual. You know, and so you have to put yourself below what is good for the broad enterprise, right? And Asians seem to have an easier time of that because of their upbringing. A second thing I found is they tend to really develop strong domain expertise. It's this thirst for knowledge and for getting to good answers and knowing what you're talking about, I think is really good, because some people will say a leader is a leader and can lead anything. I don't buy that, right? I mean, I can lead a Pampers organization, but if you put me at Facebook, I'd be a dummy, right? So that, in my view, domain expertise really makes a difference. And then the third thing I've seen is calm under pressure. You know, not getting volatile, emotional under extreme pressure is a factor I have seen among these people that I've talked to. And I think if corporate America could get a bit more of that, more Asians in these positions, we'll see more of that and we'll do better.
Wait, so that's the company, what they can do better. I totally agree with you. I think, with more role models, you'll see variation in what more.
And what Asians can bring to
people do?
corporate
What can you
America,
do?
right? In my view,
Okay.
what Asians can bring.
But what can an individual person, what can one of the listeners to you, what would you recommend the one thing they can do, okay, to respond to the fact that now I'm aware, okay, so what, Dennis?
Yeah. So I think my view is,
And then I can ask you, Jennifer. But
yeah, people do better with mentors, right? But I think you turn your mentors into coaches. So I always advise my mentees, use other people as coaches, and people who see you in action, so they can give you this feedback of, this is what I'm seeing in you, right? What were you doing there? You need to speak up more. Okay. And sometimes we kind of go overboard as Asians. Oh, speak up more. Okay, I'll speak up a lot, right? Or, you need to talk about your accomplishments. Oh, okay, I didn't mean that, right? Come on, whoa, time out, right? I think you need people who are seeing this with a level 1 up or 2 up to help you and be your mentor, who can see you in action. I think it's very important to see you in action point.
I love that.
Jennifer, go ahead, Jennifer. Don't be shy.
Okay, well, no, I just thought we'd jump in at the same time. I mean, that's exactly what I did. When I joined Chevron, I went to the employee network. We have an Asian employee network, and I got paired up with a senior female Chinese manager, a mid-level manager at that time. And she mentored me the same way. So I learned how to advocate for myself, and also leverage others to advocate for me. Everything Dennis talked about, the strengths, I think those are the things you need to bring out, because I was perceived as the super analyst when I joined the company, but I don't want to be the super analyst. I want to be a leader. So I need to start talking about how I lead, how I overcome difficult situations, instead of talking about all my problem solving skills, right? So I think that's the part individuals definitely can learn and can do.
So that leads us into the next section I talk about, and that is things that companies are doing to help Asian Americans. And I think it sounds like you mentioned one thing, that the Chevron, paired you up with somebody who could help you, right? Is that something that Chevron does for everybody, or for Asians, or for women, or what was that?
Yeah, so there is definitely a broad mentoring program. We have 12 employee networks. All the minority group have a network, and we run a mentoring program. For Asians specifically, we have an Asian employee network and a Filipino employee network. And we also have an executive version of that network at the more senior level. A couple of years ago, we started this executive Asian network to really focusing on the leadership pipeline development.
Yep.
So we pair people up, look at the high potential, high performance Asian employees, and use the senior leaders with similar background to help developing their leadership capabilities. So that's one thing we do as a company. And I personally benefited from that as mentee. I'm also mentoring other people. I'm on the steering team for the executive Asian committee. So we think that's a definitely important part of developing leadership.
So the one thing I think I've heard you say is Chevron has clearly identified minority representation at executive levels as an issue they need to address with some system, whether mentoring or partnering, whatever, and for all minorities, including Asians, and sounds like subgroups of Asians too. Is that what I hear you say?
Mm-hmm.
That's a great thing. What about Facebook? I mean, has Facebook gotten that far yet? To me, that's a great step. Has Facebook gotten that far yet?
Yeah, I think of it in terms of what companies can do kind of in 3 buckets, and maybe there's more, but I kind of think of it at 3 levels. One is at the company level, does the company recognize the issues? Does it talk about the issues? Does it create awareness? And so, like I mentioned, we have a diversity report, so we're putting out there some data. I think we've identified and we've set some goals publicly around, we call it 50 and 5 and 30 and 5. So we want to see 50% of the company be underrepresented minorities in 5 years. And then last year we set a goal of 30% increase in in people of color in the next 5 years. And so we've got these different goals. And so being very public about that and saying at the company level what we want. Then you've got what I would say is HR-led things. And so that's oftentimes training, but it can be other things as well. But it's, you know, things around bias and unconscious bias, manager training, we do a lot of that, and then a lot of allyship training. And then the third bucket is more the community side of things. And so how groups can get together, affinity groups, ERGs, that can really come together and either provide support, training, or development. So we do mentorship. We have a fair amount of allyship. We have what we call circles, where, you know, we can put together groups that are a mix of, you know, junior, mid-level, and senior people, and they meet periodically and they have certain topics that they can work on. We put together panels. We actually have done some workshops very specifically on areas we know are challenges for Asians within the company. So for example, as part of our performance review, everyone has to write a self-review. And so we have workshops in terms of how to write a self-review. And oftentimes we'll see that Asians will not use the word I in their self-review. They'll talk about we, they'll talk about the team, they'll talk about these accomplishments, but they didn't say what they did to help contribute to the success. And so they're selling themselves short. And so when they get their review, they don't feel like they've been properly recognized, but they shot themselves in the foot because they didn't share with their manager what they did. So we specifically have that as one target area, as an area that folks can work on with others. But you know, one thing I just wanted to say that Dennis had said earlier, which is, you know, getting a mentor or getting someone who can give you, who sees you in action. And can give you, because sometimes you can get paired up with a mentor who's 2-3 levels above you in a different group, and that can be helpful too. But to have someone who can actually see you in action and give you real-time feedback right afterwards. And so to me, the thing I would add to what Dennis said is talking to that person to say, hey, I'm going to work on speaking up more. I'm going to work on whatever it is that you're going to work on, and then check in with that person to say, how did I do this time? Because this way they can pay attention, and then you can circle back and get feedback. And if you find the right person, maybe you can do it for each other.
But here's a question, and about mentorship, and I want to ask Alan and Dennis, because Dennis, you're not working, so I want to ask. So there's a new generation of people coming in here, but yeah, and I stopped working much longer than you did. But when I was looking at the issue at Cisco, and we set up a mentoring program, one of the problems I saw immediately in one mentoring program was the people who went to the mentoring programs weren't the high performers. The high performers, Asian high performers, think they know it all, and they don't go to mentoring programs. And so we had to pull them out. I mean, so what's it like now? Do people ask for help, or you're gonna have to push it on them again? Because you're talking about
that. So I can tell you. So you know, to answer your first question and this question, I like answering two at the same time. So P&G tracks at each level its diversity: Asians, African Americans, Hispanics, women, especially at every single level of the company. So we start at like this 15%, it drops down, as I mentioned to you. And then we actually find, then the next step is you find the people who the organization thinks are their best people in there, and how do we help them? And one of the first things we ask is, do you have a mentor? The Asian top development people have the lowest mentorship of any of the groups. The women, the Hispanics, the African Americans, all are leveraging this mentoring thing, and the Asians are like, I don't know. And Asians are so averse to special treatment, right? We're just like, oh, special treatment. You know, I got A+, you know, in college. Why do I need special treatment? I did it on my own.
They think they know it all. They think they know it all.
Yeah, but we don't know it all, because as you know, Buck, you know, when it gets to these senior levels, especially, there's a circle of people discussing their top candidates, deciding who gets promoted. Oh, yeah. It's not like 30% midterm, 50% final, 10% class participation, You know, there's not a formula. It's just a bunch of people talking, right? They don't know what goes on in that circle. You need mentors to begin to understand what happens in those environments, right? So that's important. A second thing I would say that P&G does, which I think is very important, is they have an annual meeting where they actually have senior management talk. They share all the data on Asian progression by all the functions. They have management talk about why, you know, they think this Asian development is important. And then number 3, they invite the bosses of all the Asian people to participate in this session. And so therefore their bosses begin to understand the challenges that we're facing, what's going on, what the community's thinking, what the senior management's thinking. It's a very focused event that drives some attention. And the third thing they do is they invest in specific development for Asian Americans along the lines of what I'm talking about, because some people will suggest you could just do it in the general training. You train leadership. We give leadership training, but there's a cultural element that we've all talked about here that is very, very important. And in my retirement, Buck, I've been actually hired by P&G to do some of this training for these people, because I understand the company, I understand the challenges they're facing, and they get a different training than the corporate stuff.
So sounds like I'll try to summarize two things. One is Asian, I'll say more than anybody, it sounds like high-performing Asian Americans need to get mentors because they don't know it all. They think they do. And number two, it sounds like for it to work, companies better put together a system to not force them, but to implement that, because on their own, they're less likely to do it. That's P&G stuff. It also sounds like a lot of companies in Silicon Valley could probably use your help, Dennis, because it sounds like it sounds like you learn a lot of stuff at P&G.
Well, P&G's been at this longer. I mean, the company's been around 175 years, so, and they value diversity for a long time. A lot of these companies are new, right? So.
Okay. So I said I was going to try to wrap this up with time for Q&A. But is there anything people want to say that before we go into the Q&A session that you didn't say because I cut you off real quick?
No, you didn't cut off, but I did think of one more thing to share. I think earlier Alan talked about the 3 areas, and I totally agree. I think those are exactly the 3 areas Chevron and other companies are working on and should be working on. But I want to share one thing at Chevron we do in the talent selection process. Dennis mentioned the HR training, on the unconscious bias, so make people select people based on merit. We introduce a process to think about selection, representation in selection. Right now it's at least one person from the underrepresented gender and from the visible diverse category need to be on the selection team. And we also want the selection team will approximate the diversity of the applicant pool where possible. So last year, our company had our biggest reorganization in history, and we basically global scope reorganization. Everybody posts for jobs and compete, right? So I, because of my Asian and leadership background, I served as this role called inclusion counselor in selection meetings. And the role is to observe the selection process and really challenge when you hear people talking about candidate not based on merit, right? If there's a perceived things about their leadership, capabilities, you challenge that selection. You use data and facts for selection versus just perception and appearance. So I learned from that process. I really think we got a great process to do the systematic part of the change. I mean, individuals can do a lot of things to really get through the headwinds. But I think the company can definitely do the systematic change to use better process, more fair process to manage the talent pool.
Okay. Okay. Anything else? So Esther, I'm gonna call Esther back in. I hope Esther has been monitoring some of the Q&A because I've been having fun here, so I haven't had a chance to read.
Okay.
So.
All right. So let me read some of the questions, and Buck, you decide what to do. Do you think working remotely will change the workplace dynamic for Asians? And the second question is, after decades of limited improvement, should we explore other options? I hear from HR executives that Asians have the highest turnover of any group in their companies.
So, first question: Does remote
will change remote, the workplace?
I think the answer is yes. I think the issue with, I'll say, remote working and its impact on Asia, as my view, is that it makes it harder to have a conversation. So people who are reluctant to speak up anyway, being remote is just another excuse for not jumping in the conversation. So I think it's going to hurt Asians' ability unless they're aware of this problem and take and affirmatively do something. Be sure they're not overlooked. I think that's a problem. Any of the comments about the effect on remote work on Asian Americans?
The thing I would say maybe is that I think it creates an opportunity, because I think with remote work, everyone feels disconnected. Everyone feels a lack of cohesion. Everyone is not making the same relationships
Right.
they used to when we were in the office. And so it creates an opening for people, any person, but for Asians, to actually try to excel a little bit more than others, because everyone is equally disadvantaged here. So it's kind of a leveling of the playing field. And I think it's a chance to step up, as opposed to trying to do this on a different field where Asians may feel more disadvantaged.
With regard to the question about Asians having high leaving more often, that's counter to most of the data I've seen. Most of the data I've seen, typically Asians are the most satisfied and the least likely to leave. I don't know about usually it's Hispanics and Blacks is data I've seen, but I don't know. Anybody has seen anything else?
I don't know any data at national level. I mean, Chevron has very learner attrition rates in general, so I don't even know the Asian data. But personally, I think if you're unhappy, you leave. I mean, that's not necessarily the best solution. Just the grass is not necessarily greener on the other side, right? So I think if that's the way to address the issue, I don't think that's a sustainable issue. Sustainable way to address the issue.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't have data either, but I wish Asians would actually be willing to leave more, because I think that creates a situation where you're willing to speak up more. You're willing to try things, because if you're willing to leave, you're willing to change, and you might as well, as opposed to having this "let's play it safe" mentality, which is I don't want to get fired, I don't want to get noticed, I don't want to make a mistake. So if people are willing to say, hey, you know what, I want to go somewhere another place that'll recognize me. Why not try to make the change there? And the thing that Dennis mentioned around, there's a secret group that decides, who gets promoted, who doesn't. This is one of the problems I think that Asians have, is that they don't know how promotions get made at companies, that there's calibration, there's other groups that are talking about you. And I've heard this so many times where, Asians don't ask for promotions. And so because they don't ask, people don't think that they want it. And of course they want it, but they're hoping to get it without having to ask. And so I've heard this at Google, I heard this at Facebook, for people who never got promoted to VP. It wasn't until they finally asked that the manager said, I didn't know you wanted it because you never asked. And this is at the highest levels that people still aren't asking, and people are interpreting that to mean that you're not interested.
So I want to jump in just one comment from an executive perspective. People work for me. My goal is to keep my people and keep them motivated. And the more I know about what keeps them motivated and keeps them happy, I will give them work to do that. So if I don't know what people want, then I won't give them opportunities to get it, because a lot of people are asking different things. But our job is keep our people motivated, happy, and working hard, right? So anything you can do to tell your manager to do that, is helpful for both you and your manager. Okay. Dennis, do you want to say anything?
No, I think that's great. I think these guys covered it.
Okay. Esther,
Okay,
other
next.
questions?
Yes. As Buck said, why hasn't it changed even though we know the issue? So my question to the panelists, what do they think will lead to systematic or structural change long-term?
I have an answer, but
I'll give an answer.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So a part of my research, understanding this topic, is what I think we as Asians have to appreciate is the spigots were turned off for Asians to come to the United States for long periods of time, until 1965, the Immigration Act of 1965, where they eliminated in the United States all racial quotas, all country-based quotas, right? And they put a bias on scientists, engineers, doctors, businessmen to come in. It's more of a criteria-based than a country-based system. And Asians are coming to the US in large droves from 1965, but we are the newcomers. So I think the reason we have such a large cultural situation is because we're relatively new in the US. And I'm going to predict in 50 years, a lot of the development we're doing, a lot of the discussions like we're having here, Asians are going to be doing amazingly well in the US. But who wants to wait 50 years? That's my attitude. You know, it's like, these are talented people. They can accomplish a lot. They could add to corporate America. Let's make it happen faster, in my view. And it's already starting to happen. So the more we do things like this, the more we offer development programming. And Buck, I know your friend Wes Hom, for example, is doing development programming. I'm doing development programming.
Yeah.
The more we get people who have learned a lot about this, helping our younger people learn faster, we're going to accelerate this process. I think there's a lack of that today, but we're building it as we go.
One comment I want to make is that the story I have from Google. So a friend of mine, a VP at Google, was pushing for make changes inside Google, and the feedback and one comment that she got from an HR person at Google is, one of the reasons we never done anything is because every year we do these employee surveys at Google. You know the story, Ellen, and where there are gaps in satisfaction, we try to fill those gaps. We're a data-driven company. We wouldn't do the right thing, right? And according to our data, the Asians at Google are the happiest folks here. You're not complaining about anything. Everybody's complaining about something. So working on their issues so part of the problem, part of the reason that nothing's being done, because our community is not asking for it as a community. So what do you expect?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think a squeaky wheel gets the grease, and the companies rightfully focus on the areas that they think are the biggest problems because it's the loudest. And so I think, like, what's going to lead to systematic change, I think people leaving. I think, when people leave a company because they're not seeing satisfaction, they're not seeing growth, they're not seeing promotion, they don't see recognition, they go someplace else that does, they're going to change. And I think what's going to happen is that some companies will get better, and that will become a competitive advantage. I think the other thing, though, is that I think for us as Asians, we have to stop focusing on the technical skills and start to understand that it's the soft skills, especially at the higher levels, that matter. At some point, technical skills become irrelevant, or they become much less important than those soft skills. And so we have to understand that managing up and self-promotion and branding, communication, leadership, executive presence, those things really matter. We never learned that before. At least I was always taught that, hey, you need to have the technical skills. That's important in the beginning. Later, it's going to be the soft skills.
So on that note, because we're close to closing the hour, and I think we can run over a little bit, but I'll start it this way. So let's talk about those skills in particular that you think are needed that people don't get because they're just so technical. And the question I saw come in, and what are some resources that people can look to get those skills, right?
Yeah, but I think there are many resources. If you want to learn something, Asian.
Well, first of all, what's names of skills? First of all, what skills first do you think they should go learn, take courses to go learn?
Yeah, I think Alan already ran a long list of skills.
Okay, all right, okay.
I want to say one thing, actually, not in the skill area, is really your drive. Are you motivated? I see many Asians, just because it's so hard, they give up, right? Because they're headwinds, because we're perceived maybe don't have the leadership that they think the way it should be. And then many times just, well, I'm happy to be a senior technical professional and just be satisfied. So I think that to me is even a bigger risk, a bigger factor here for the chart you just showed than the skill set. If a person's made up a mind to learn, you can learn anything, right? No matter how hard it is, because I mean, a lot of people work hard to get into the best schools. That's not easy, right? So to learn a new skill, yeah, you can learn any new skill if you want to learn it. So you first need to find your drive. And I think the Asians, again, our culture is more in the team, collective culture, not necessarily individual. Sometimes, people say, I'm good enough, I'm happy enough, I don't want to that. So find your motivation. And to me, like motivation, if it's not for individual, think about what influence you can have when you have a seat at the table for others. You know,
But
for
but
your
look,
community, for your team.
but I want to push back a little bit in the sense that, not that you're wrong, but the difficulty of sort of learning a new formula, for example, or a new process, is something which you think positively, because but then when you think about the not speaking up and needing to speak up, then there's an emotional. It's not just a knowledge content. There's an emotional step that people have to move to too. So it's a little bit harder, I think.
It is in the sense you have to get out of your comfort zone, right? And you speak up, there is definitely a risk factor. You could be wrong. You could get rejected, right? So that's why I feel like motivation is very important, because it takes effort to do something. If you don't have a strong motivation, you won't do it. You simply just give up. So I think it's the motivation that pushes you through, and find your motivation. And for some of us, the motivation could be think about what your parents sacrificed to send you here, and you want to do the best to reach your potential. For others, it could be for the team you represent. You don't want the team did great work and don't get recognized. If you don't do it for yourself, do it for others. So you find your own motivation somehow, some way.
But then that ties into something that Dennis said earlier about, I forget what he said at the end, but basically cultural specific or Asian specific, right? Because
so I'd give you a few thoughts, Buck.
Yeah.
Is I think what will systemically change this is we're going to need more Asians in executive positions, because I don't believe we change a company from the bottom up. I think we change it from the top down. And P&G's made great progress with women, and women in executives have made the company a better place. It's more inclusive, it's more collaborative, but they needed a few pioneers to get up there and educate, because they're in the circle that I've described, right? They're not like trying to speak to a circle that's an unknown thing. And a couple of things I'd say is, I think the work Ascend is doing and what SACE is trying to do to give people these soft skills, but understanding the cultural nuance, right? Making them aware that, you know, the cultural undertones that create these behaviors is really, really great. So I really applaud the work Ascend has done. I think we're trying to emulate that for the technical folks. But the thing that I think is really important is you've got to have this connection to senior management at your company.
Totally.
Because what I'm now seeing is that the culture of these different companies is different. You know, at P&G, we only promote from within. We have our own language, the way we say things, the way you build on someone's point. It's a language unto itself. It's a culture unto itself. And if you're not tuned into that with the executives in your company, you might make some missteps that would work at Cisco, but just don't work at P&G.
Yeah, I think in some of the literature they talk about the unwritten rules, right? And so every company has their unwritten rules. It's not what you learned in college or you learned in anywhere, but every company is different. And so being able to tap into the people who know how to get things done, how decisions get made, who gets promoted, who doesn't get promoted, who are the key influencers. You need to be able to tap into the right network that can share with you what those unwritten rules are within a company. So I totally agree. I think, when it comes to resources, I would start with your own HR learning and development group. Oftentimes they will have some trainings that can be tailored to, what the specific needs are for a group. And so they may have some things around management, and there's some specific, modules that could be retrofitted specifically for an Asian population, an Asian community within a company. But if you don't have that, you go outside and you look at like organizations like Ascend. Dennis, you mentioned we brought in Ascend a couple of years ago to do some training. They've got a series called the Executive Insight Series that Buck and others teach, and it's very targeted to the needs of Asians. And there's modules in very specific areas that they can up-level, upskill, and train. So if you don't have the resources internally, there's plenty of, I think, resources today on the outside that are very targeted and specific for Asians.
So I think, by the way, I would slightly disagree with you, Dennis, in the sense that how to get from here to there. I think I would agree partly with you. I think where we are now, I believe in that. I think the moment we have now, there are non-Asian executives, leaders who are listening to the community. And if the community does speak, they can make progress now because people are more aware of it, more sensitized to it. And it sounds like the community wants to say more. So a lot of stuff. I hope it's not just this month that people are talking about it, that continues moving forward. But I think that's the opportunity the community has.
And my only, okay, this may be controversial, but okay, but my observation is I don't want them to promote Asians out of guilt, right? If it's not true sponsorship and real belief that the people can do the job and putting their reputation on a line, they're going to fail down the road, right? You know, maybe they hit a few numbers temporarily, but then problems are going to occur.
So, but here's
observation.
In that case, but I agree with it. But that's we're not. I'll tell you the John Chambers story then. So what John said is after John said, I get it, you have a problem. Okay. He said, I don't know what the problem is. You know, he said, us Asian leaders said, okay, you tell me what to do, and I'll figure it out. I'll support you. You do it. So the issue isn't, you know, isn't the answer should come from the community and from the Asian executives and leaders in the community. Okay, not from John Chambers. He didn't know what the hell he was going to do, and he didn't, and so he couldn't tell HR what to do. So the opportunity here is for the leadership in these companies, if they feel safe to do it, and I think 9 times they should feel safe to do it, they can take the lead, and that's what we should be doing. People like you in a P&G say, here's what we should be doing, right? That's
I agree with
that
that.
needs to be done. Okay.
Yep.
Anyway, that's what they can do.
Actually, that's a question about mentors. So I think, regarding mentors, should we look for an Asian American leader as a mentor because we have similar cultural background and easy to understand and communicate? Or actually it is better to have a non-Asian American leader?
I would say you can do both. You know, my experience with mentors, I got so many, so I learned different things from different people. I think, you know, for a person looking for help, you need to know what you're looking for. And I think from similar people, you learn certain things, and from people totally different, I think you actually learn something you may not even know. So I see both ways.
I'd agree. Yeah.
Yep. At least one of each.
My caveat is only if both parties are willing to be honest.
Agree. It has to be psychological safety.
You can't. I'll say you can't have a mentor be afraid to say something because they're afraid they're gonna say something inappropriate in terms of racial comment. Okay, and you should not be so sensitive when they say that to make it appear there's a microaggression. Okay, you have to be honest. When somebody's going to criticize you for doing something wrong, you have to accept the criticism as criticism.
Well said.
Yep. You need a thick
skin.
If you show a thick skin, they give you the truth, but you have to show a thick skin.
That's why if you have an Asian, there's no concern about hidden agendas, right?
Yep.
So, but as long as both people are honest and can take that honesty, it's great.
Yeah.
There's a statement here, and I want to see if you guys want to answer it. No one mentioned the importance of networking, like social skills, lunch and dinner, golf, which Asians have not culturally been adept at. You guys want to respond to this?
Go, Dan.
Yeah, well, I like the word relationship building more than networking, because some people think just going and chatting with somebody is like super important. But I think what's really important that I've seen across these companies I've been working with is you got to build relationships. And many times Asians think, oh gosh, that's not the real work. No, it's the real work. And when you get into leadership, you need to make big things happen. Into uncertainty, you need relationships. You need people to come along with you, and it matters a lot.
Yeah, and we put building a relationship as part of the Chevron leadership expectations. You know, it's align and inspire, building a relationship, grow capabilities, and deliver results. All important.
Yeah, and networking sounds like an activity to me. The point is to meet relationships. That's the key thing you need to build.
Yeah, and network also kind of signal that is about who knows who, you know, and a lot of social activities. I think it touched on earlier, both Dennis and Alan touched on the company culture. If you have a great company culture, I talk about the selection process, for example. Yeah, it does matter who you know in your professional circle about your capabilities and they advocate for you. And it's not about, who watch football together.
There's some research on this, and two issues are forget the word is, but things you have in common and things you have not in common. And the more things you have in common, the more likely that you have a relationship you can have a conversation on. The research says you have to have at least 4 things in common that you can talk about so you can relate to each other. If you have nothing in common other than the work, then that's not a really good relationship. So you have to have something in common. So you don't have to play golf. It doesn't have to, it can be kids, it can be the school you went to, it can be the neighborhood you live in. As long as you have something to talk about, they can relate to you as a person, then they can begin to trust you. Begin to trust you, then you can work with them. So that's it. Like
I think I totally agree. I think relate to people, but for Asians, especially me as Asian female, well, I don't have things in common to talk about sports,
That's right.
Band. But I find actually one of my coaches taught me, well, you can find way to relate to people even if you don't share the common hobbies. For example, you can ask questions, show interest, want to know more. So I mean, in your networking, that's a good tip for me, just how to relate to people.
There's a question, I think, more for Alan that you bring it up just now. So they say, how do we appropriately and preactively ask for promotion or self-promote without being misinterpreted as arrogant or overconfidence?
I think there's a lot of ways to do it. I mean, and this is why practicing, this is why talking to others helps. You can bring it up. I think fairly, like there's a range from, being a little bit more combative to like saying, I'd like to know why I haven't been promoted, to being a little bit safer and just saying, I'd like to talk about what it would take to get promoted. Right. And so there's a range, there's ways to bring things up. At Facebook, we talk about impact. And so impact and scope, there's certain things that when you talk about promotion, you need to know what are the elements that go into promotion. So you can talk about the elements if that's where you want to go. But you can talk about a range of things. Unfortunately, at a company like Facebook, we have a lot of younger people. So there's this generation that when they talk about career development, they're talking about promotion, right? Mm-hmm. They're not talking about like new opportunities and personal growth and I want to try something different. They're talking about when am I going to get promoted? And they're looking at the averages. They want to know how they can beat the average. They're disappointed when they don't get it. But I had someone just recently tell me, and he doesn't report to me, but he's deeper in my organization. And I was doing some skip level meetings, and he said that, for the last 2 years, I've been waiting to be promoted, and I never got it. And I asked him, well, what conversations have you had? He said, well, I never brought it up. And I was just hoping and waiting that I would get it one day. And it's been 2 years and I haven't gotten it yet. So we had to have a conversation about how he needs to bring it up. But I think certainly there should be safe ways to bring it up. As I mentioned, just asking like, what does it take to get promoted? What kind of scope do I need to demonstrate? What kind of performance do I need to have to be at the next level?
So we're actually out of time. We're running a little over. So let's go around and say, is there one thing you'd like to leave, a bit of wisdom or advice or comment, each of you like to leave to the people listening or watching? Jennifer, let's start with you. Or anybody if they know what they want to say. So.
Yeah, I think everybody has a role to play in changing the reality. I think what Buck you showed there is what we're facing everywhere in every company. So what we do, there's definitely a systematic way that corporation level can do. There are also things individuals we can do. You can advocate for yourself. You can also advocate for others, whatever opportunities you have. And you can also support the people in your community and advocate for the group by sharing our value, our strengths with others. So this is the issue that we need to continue to push through.
Dennis?
Yeah.
Or,
so,
either one.
Okay, our observation, nobody complains about Asians for their technical skills that I have seen as a group, right? So the whole point is leadership development and it's a job that you need to take on. I think Jennifer described it. You need to take time. You need to give it some priority. You need to put yourself out there, try things that are a little uncomfortable, learn, develop mentors, even though you wouldn't normally think of doing that thing, and make it a part of your job. Because if you don't allocate time with it, you just won't get there, in my view. Other people are doing this. You need to do it too, is what I would say for our Asian organization.
Okay.
Yeah, and mine probably isn't radically that different from Jennifer or Dennis, but I would say we need to be less patient. I think as a community, we're very willing to just turn the other cheek and wait and hope that something's going to happen. And hope is not a plan. We've got to actually push and make things happen and make change happen. It doesn't happen to us. It's going to happen because of us. And I would say that as each person progresses in their careers and achieves success, this is kind of similar to what Jennifer was saying. Don't just think about how you're going to continue on that path. Turn around and help the person behind you as well, because we're going to succeed as a group and as a community, not as a series of individuals.
Okay. And I say this only, I would thank you normally, but and just close, but because somebody asked me on the Q&A, say what Buck, what would you say? So I just have to say one thing, and I'm basically summarize everything that everybody said. The way I look at it is that you need to ask for what you want. First, we have to know what you want. Okay, and we talk about ambition. Then you have to ask for what you want, which is really being sure that they know. Not again, no matter how good you, doesn't matter how good you think you are. It's more important that they know you good. And the last thing is, and kind of mirroring what everybody else has said here, if you want it to change, then control your career, you decide what's important to you, and you decide if it's important, then do it. As Alan said, you're gonna be the one to make it happen, because no one else is gonna make it. No one else is gonna make it happen if you don't. So so it's up to you to make that to be different. Okay, and that's my advice. And I think we're all saying the same thing one way or another, right? So and it has nothing to do with throwing away any Asian values you have. It has nothing to do with it. It has understanding how the game is played, and playing the game and being true to your own value. And I think that's the right thing to do. And with that, thank you all. This has been a great conversation. Esther.
Yes. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Buck, Jennifer, Alan, and Dennis. This has been the most valuable advice we can get. And we thank you for your precious time as well with us. And one important question from the attendees will this be recorded? They want to pass it to the next generation to watch. And yes, this is recorded, and we will put it in YouTube, and we're going to share it to public. But please give us some time, because we still have a few more weeks of webinar we need to work on. And once it's done, we will get all the webinars in public to share with everybody. So thank you again. And please go to our website, chf.us/AAPI Talks. And we still have a few weeks of webinar, and hope that you guys are going to join us. So thank you again, and have a great night.